everyone. One of the few pleasures that the lockdown has revealed, certainly to me, one of those underrated pleasures is having a haircut. How brilliant to have been able to do that this past week. Anyway, we continue in John Newton, Letters of a Slave Trader Freed by God's Grace, and we're on to chapter 5. My dear Harveys, the following 2 years seem like an absolute blank. Since the hour of the Lord's grace to me was not yet come, I went deeper and deeper into wickedness, the way the heart of man always does when left to itself. Actually, looking back on those experiences now, I see the mercy of the Lord in banishing me to that remote land at a time when I was big with mischief, like a person diseased and very capable of spreading the infection wherever I went. Had I been in England, among my own countrymen, my wickedness would have been far greater in scope. Out in Africa, I came into touch with only a few people and could do them little harm. The few I did have to talk with were too much like myself, and I soon sank too low to have any kind of influence at all. During the first year of my residence among them, some slaves thought themselves too good to speak to me. The appointed time for the Lord to rescue me from myself was not until long after this. Only by his grace did I not lose my mind at this time. The sufferings I endured did slow down my rush to sin, and for this reason I count them among my blessings. You would probably be interested in the country I was now confined to. The places I frequented at that time in my life became the locale in which I conducted my trade later. Actually, I would do business in the same places and with the same people who were then considering me on a level with their lowest slaves. From Cape de Verde, the most western part of Africa, to Cape Mount, the whole coast is full of rivers. The main ones are the Gambia, the Rio Grande, the Sierra Leone, and the Sherbro. I was never on the Gambia, but the Rio Grande is quite familiar to me. Like the Nile, it divides into many branches near the sea. On the most northern, called the Cachio, the Portuguese have a settlement. The most southern branch, known by the name of Rio Nuna, was a boundary line between which white men did not go to trade. The Sierra Leone territory is a mountainous peninsula, uninhabited and inaccessible because of the thick jungle that comes down to the waterline. The Sherbro River is large and navigable. Just over 40 miles to the southeast are 3 islands called the Bananos. The perimeter around all 3 is about 20 miles. This is the center of the white man's residential colony. Some 24 miles in the same direction lie the Plantains, 3 small islands just 2 miles off the coast where the Sherbro meets the sea. This river is more like an ocean sound because several large rivers join it there. The most southern of these has a very peculiar course, running almost parallel to the coast, sometimes not more than half a mile distant. My new master had formerly resided near Cape Mount. More frequently, he settled at the Plantains on the largest of the 3 islands. It is a low, sandy island, about 2 miles in circumference and almost covered with palm trees. We immediately began to build a house and to enter upon our trade. I had a real desire to make something of myself, since I'd lost so much time. I'm sure I would have gotten along very well with my new employer had he not turned against me. He was wound around the finger of a black woman who lived with him as his wife. She was a person of some consequence in her own country, and he knew he owed his prosperity initially to her. For some reason, she took an instant dislike to me. What made things worse was that I succumbed to a severe illness soon after I got there, before I had any chance to show him what I could do for him in his business. I was still sick when he left on a trip to Rio Nuna, leaving me in this woman's hands. At first she took care of me, but when I failed to recover soon, she grew weary and neglected me completely. I could not even get a glass of cold water from anyone who was burning with fever, when I was burning with fever. My bed was a mat spread on a chest. A log of wood was my pillow. When my fever left me and my appetite returned, no one gave me anything to eat. She lived high, but she hardly gave me enough to sustain my life. Now and then, when she was feeling superior, she would send me food from her own plate after dinner. So greatly had I been humiliated that I received this with thanks and eagerness, as a beggar does a penny. Once she even called me into her house to receive this from her own hand, but I was so weak and feeble that I dropped the plate. People who have plenty cannot imagine what that does to one in my condition, and she was cruel enough to laugh at my chagrin. Though the table was covered with dishes, she refused to give me any more food. At times I would be so ravenous that I would go out at night and pull up roots in the plantation, at the risk of being punished as a thief. I would eat them raw on the spot, for fear someone would see me. Boiled or roasted, those roots are delicious. Raw, they taste like potatoes. Occasionally, strangers and even some of the slaves would slip crumbs to me from their own meagre handouts. They would have been punished if anyone had seen them. To make matters worse, this woman would sometimes pay me a visit, not to pity or comfort me, but to insult me. She would call me worthless and lazy and compel me to get up and walk, which I could hardly do. She would then get her slaves to mimic my motion, clap their hands, laugh, and throw limes at me. If they chose to throw stones, she didn't stop them. All of her slaves were required to take part in humiliating me, but once she was out of sight, even the lowliest of them pitied me. Finally, my employer returned. I complained of the treatment his woman had given me, but he would not believe it, and since she was within earshot, she made sure I got no better treatment. On his second voyage, my master took me with him. We did pretty well for a while, until a brother trader he met in the river persuaded him that I was unfaithful and stole his goods in the night, or when he was on shore. That was the only vice I could not be justly charged with. I was honest, if nothing else. I had always been faithful with the things he had put in my charge, even though I had every reason to get even with him for the way his woman had treated me. But he believed the charge made against me, and condemned me without evidence. From that time on, he never trusted me out of his sight. When he left the ship, he would lock me up with only a pint of rice for my day's allowance. If he stayed longer, I had no relief until he returned. I would have starved if I had not been able to catch a few fish. When birds were killed for his dinner, I often got some of the entrails to use for bait. About the time of the changing of the tides, when the current was still, I would fish, and I often caught something. I cannot tell you what joy I felt when I caught a fish on my hook. Such a fish, hastily broiled, or rather half burned, without sauce, salt, or bread, often gave me a delicious meal. If I caught nothing, I would sleep my hunger away until the slack water returned. Then I would try again. My clothes were threadbare. What clothes there were! I had a shirt, a pair of trousers, a cotton handkerchief, instead of a cap, and about 2 yards of cotton cloth to wrap around me. But no more than that. I had been exposed to up to 40 hours of incessant rains and gales of winds, without the least shelter, when my master was on shore. I developed violent pains, which still bother me years later. The excessive cold and wet that I endured so soon after I had recovered from my long sickness not only broke my physical health, but broke my spirit. Better days later picked up my spirits, but it had taken years to overcome the effects of my physical breakdown. About 2 months later, we returned to the plantains. The rest of the time I was with that master was spent on that island. My haughty heart had been brought down completely. I had lost the fierceness that fired me on board the Harwich. But looking back, I can see that I was no more changed than a tiger is tamed by hunger. Remove the trial, and I would be as wild as ever. Strangely enough, I could collect my mind and do mathematical studies in the midst of all that. I had bought Barrow's Euclid at Plymouth, It was the only volume I had bought on shore when I joined this new employer. It was always with me. I used to take it to remote corners of the island by the seashore and draw my diagrams with a long stick on the sand. That way I often calmed my sorrows and almost forgot my feelings of anger and hatred. Without any assistance, I mastered the first 6 chapters of Euclid. So, letter number 6, my new master. My dear Harveys, Jacob made a statement that haunts me. Running from Esau, he had crossed the Jordan River. Years later, when returning home, he said, "With my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands." That was my experience, for during the mournful days to which my last letter refers, I was put to work planting lime and lemon trees. The plants I put in the ground were no taller than a young gooseberry bush. Walking by, my employer and his mistress paused to watch what I was doing. "Who knows," he remarked, "by the time these trees grow up and bear, you may go home to England, obtain the command of a ship, and return to reap the fruits of your labours. We see strange things happen sometimes." He meant that as cutting sarcasm. I believe he thought it was as probable that I should be the King of Poland. Yet it did prove to be a prediction. When I did return from England as a ship's captain, I did pluck some of the first limes from those very trees. What a contrast my life is now to the way it was then. I used to creep out in the dead of night to wash my one shirt on the rocks. I would put it on wet so that it would dry while I slept. When a ship's boat came to the island, I would hide in the woods, ashamed to be seen by strangers. And had you known, my friend, that my conduct, my principles, and my heart were still darker than my outward condition, you would marvel more at God's providential care and goodness. I simply cannot get over the transformation he accomplished when he made me acceptable to himself in the Beloved. He gave me friends who loved me in spite of my past. He protected and guided me through a long series of dangers. I owe it to him that I am still alive and that I am not still living in hunger, thirst, and nakedness. He delivered me and brought me to an easier life. I know many of his people. I am a friend of several of his most honored servants. I have an experimental knowledge of the power of his gospel. It is as difficult to count up my present privileges as it is to fully describe the evils and miseries of my past life that contrast with them. I don't know exactly how long things continued in that unhappy state. I believe it was nearly a year. During that time I wrote to my father 2 or 3 times, giving him an account of my location and circumstances. I wanted him to help me. I told him that I would not return to England unless he wanted me to come and would send for me. I also have letters I wrote to the one I loved. At my lowest point, I still retained a hope of seeing her again. My father did speak to a friend of his in Liverpool. That man gave orders to a captain of his own, who was even then fitting out a ship bound for Gambia and Sierra Leone. Within the year, as I have said, I obtained my master's consent to live with another trader on the same island. Without his consent, I could not have made the switch. He had been unwilling to let me go earlier, but he changed his mind. That move was certainly an advantage for me. I was soon decently clothed. I lived in plenty. I was considered a useful companion, and my new employer trusted me with the care of all his household effects, valued at $5,000, a significant investment at that time. That man had several white servants and factories in different places, particularly one along the Kitam, the river which runs along the seacoast. He soon appointed me to go there, giving me a share in managing his business. Another of his servants lived with me and shared my responsibilities. We did as we pleased. Business flourished, and our employer was satisfied. I even began to think myself happy. You know, there is a phrase we use in those parts to describe such a happiness. We would say, the white man has grown black. It's not a matter of skin color, but of disposition. I've known several men who have settled in Africa after they've turned 30 or 40, and who have let the life of the place gradually colour their view of life, their customs, and even their patriotism. They have grown to prefer Africa to their own country. They've even adopted all the religious nonsense of the blacks and put more trust in amulets and divinations of the primitives than the wiser natives do. I was finding that a sense of that infatuation with things black was growing on me. In time, perhaps, I might have yielded to that way of life. I had not lost my ties to England, of course, but the fact that I had no hope of ever getting home again made me willing to remain where I was. It was a way of coping with that disappointment. But isn't that like the Lord? As soon as I had fixed that way of thinking in my mind, he purposed to break that mental set in pieces and deliver me from ruin in spite of myself. The ship that had orders to bring me home arrived at Sierra Leone. The captain asked about me there and then, and when he put in at the Bananos. Someone told him I was a great distance away in the country, and he thought no more about me. But surely the hand of God had placed me at Kittim at just that time. If I'd been at the Plantains, I would not have heard of the ship until she had sailed on. The same thing would have been true if my new master had set me to go and work in a factory of his. At Kittim, I was only a mile from the sea coast. I was at that very time, just about to go inland, some distance from the sea, on a matter of trade. I'd planned to set out a day or two before, but we decided to wait for a few things we needed that the next ship arriving would probably bring. My friend and I used the time to walk on the beach, where we would see any ship that passed by. I admit it was a remote hope, since not many ships put into that particular place to trade. Sometime in February 1747, I don't know the exact day, my fellow servant saw a vessel sailing past and lit a fire to tell the captain we were interested in trade. He had already passed beyond the place because he had a good wind. Half an hour later, he would not have seen the signal, but he threw out his anchor at that point, and my friend, using a canoe, went on board. One of the first questions the captain asked my friend concerned me. When he learned that I was so near, he came on shore himself to deliver his message. Had an invitation from home reached me when I was sick and starving at the Plantains, I would have considered it life from the dead, but now, for the reasons I've already told you, I did not care as much. The captain, having found me, did not want to lose me, so he made up a story about having misplaced a large packet of letters and papers addressed to me. Those would have explained what he now was going to tell me, he said. Apparently a person had recently died and left me a lot of money. The captain said that he had orders to pay up to the amount of half the cargo if it cost that, to redeem me from my present indebtedness to my master. Everything he said was false, I learned later. I thought over what he was telling me. My father's care for me and desire to see me was not enough to make me want to leave, but memories of my loved one, the hope of seeing her again, and the possibility that by accepting this offer I might once more be in a position to win her consent to marry me, this convinced me. The captain further promised, and he did keep his word about this, that I would live in his cabin, eat at his table, and be his constant companion without having to do any work to pay for it. Once again, I was suddenly freed from a captivity of about 15 months. 1 hour before, I'd had no thought of making the change. I took him up on his offer at once, gathered my few belongings, and went on board. In a few hours, I was far away from Kittim. So blind and stupid was I at that time that I never thought twice about it. Like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed, as in James 1:6, I was governed by present appearances and never looked further. But the one who is eyes to the blind was leading me in a way I knew not, the same way he has worked in the lives of countless others. How many small events in the life of Joseph had such an influence on the small one following? If he had not dreamed, he would not have told his dream. If the Midianites had passed a day sooner or a day later, he would not have landed in Egypt. If they'd sold him to any person but Potiphar, if his mistress had been a better woman, or if Pharaoh's officers had not displeased their Lord, all that followed would have been different. The promises and purposes of God concerning Israel, the bondage, deliverance, wanderings, and eventual settlement in the Promised Land all seem to have hinged on the exact timing of the preceding events. If history had not been as it was, according to God's plan, then the promised Saviour would not have appeared. Mankind would have remained in its sins without hope. The counsels of God's eternal love would have been defeated. We find a connection between Joseph's first dream, the history of the Jews, and the death of our Lord Jesus Christ. All glorious sequences of great and small events. What a comfort it is to know that, despite all the interference of men and nations in their attempts to frustrate any kind of righteous testimony on earth, the Lord has one constant design. From the foundation of the world, he has planned the complete salvation of his people. He has been wise and strong and faithful to make even those things which opposed his design to be the things that promoted it. And here we end today. May I say that as I read that, I was aware that we are reading a book of its time, aren't we? So please bear with that as we read through this. The value systems of the 21st century certainly were not the value systems of John Newton as he wrote this book. God bless you all.